Let's talk about some basic concepts in weaned pig nutrition. We're going to talk about nutrient requirements, nutrient recommendations, what's the difference between requirements and recommendations. We'll look at the digestive capacity of the weaned pig. We'll look at feed quality. We'll touch on diets for weaned pigs with a little bit of emphasis in soybean products, as well as a little bit more in-depth conversations about the protein level, and we'll close up with some feeding recommendations for weaned pigs. We've seen these graphs before, and we're going to see them a few more times. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the requirement for lysine in grams per day in the red line, and in the black line, we're looking at the daily lean gain in grams per day in pigs. And we can see that these two lines, they sort of have the same general shape. And basically what this is indicating us is that as the lean deposition rate in pigs goes up, so does the requirement of lysine and other nutrients. In this other graph, what we're looking at on the black line is the daily feed intake in kilograms per day. So as the pig increases in body weight, it will consume more and more feed. Although the requirement for lysine in grams per day is increasing as the body weight of the pig increases, because the increment in feed intake it's greater than the increase in the requirement of lysine. Therefore, the net result is an apparent reduction in the needs of lysine. But actually, what we have is that we need less concentration of lysine and other nutrients in the diets of pigs as they grow, but the requirement continues to increase on a grams per day basis. We have seen this graph before, and again, I want to emphasize that when we are providing pigs with a diet, because the nutritional or the nutrient proportions of that diet is fixed, so the diet doesn't change. And what that basically means for pigs is that at some point in time, that diet will be providing nutrients above the requirements of those pigs, and therefore will be feeding excess nutrients. And at some other points later on in the phase, then that diet could be deficient because we are not have the correct density of nutrients. So when we're doing phase feeding, we always encounter this dilemma that at some point in times we are deficient in nutrients at the beginning of the feeding phase, and then we have excess nutrients at the end of the feeding phase. And that's why the practical recommendation is to provide as many feeding phases as possible, because that will follow more closely the nutrient requirements of the pigs. It will be better for the physiology of the pigs. It will reduce feed cost greater because we're minimizing that amount of excess nutrients that we're providing, and will minimize the waste of nutrients coming out of these pigs. If we look at the cumulative feed intake as a function of body weight, then we get this type of function. And then we estimate, according to the data provided by PIC, we estimate that about 28 kilograms of feed are going to be consumed by a pig up to 25 kilograms of body weight. And this is what we're going to call the weaning phase period. From 25 until market, whether market it's 100 kilograms or 125 kilograms or whatever other number we want to estimate, then we have the cumulative intake that we can estimate. So a 100 kilogram pig is going to eat about 204 kilograms of feed, and a 125 kilogram pig is going to eat about 285 kilograms of feed. Why are we looking at these numbers? We're looking at these numbers because I'm interested in looking at the proportion of feed that pertains to the weaning period. Particularly the phase one, when we're talking about somewhere between 1 to 10 kilograms of body weight, yes, this is the feed of the pig that is the most expensive on a dollars per metric ton of feed. However, when we calculate that these pigs are going to eat less than 5 kilos of feed, depending what the market weight of these animals are going to be, 100 or 125 kilos, for example, then those 4.7 kilos of a very high expensive diet only represents 2.3 or 1.7% of the total feed intake of these animals. We can calculate the economic impact of these, and the bottom line is that these very early weaned pig diets, although they're very high in price on a dollars per metric ton, on a dollars per cumulative feed intake, the contribution of these diets is not going to be as great as we think because of our bias due to the cost per metric ton. If we look at the entire nursery phase, and then the third phase, or on a 3 feeding phase program, the cost will be considerably reduced there because we no longer have the use of specialty ingredients. If we look at the nursery phase is going to be somewhere between less than 10 to almost 14% of cumulative feed intake. So proportionally, in terms of the cost of feed intake, it's not that big of a proportion. If we look at, if we go to a finisher 1 or a finisher 2, then the amount of feed that is going to be consumed by those animals are going to be considerably higher. Therefore, the majority of the cost of the feeding cost will come from the grower finishing period, and not due to the nursery diets, and certainly not likely due to the first 2 feeding phase diets. So we don't have a huge impact of the cost of those very expensive diets on the total cost of feeding a pig, but those diets have a huge impact on the ability of the pig to do that transitioning from the lactation period to the wean period, from that warm, liquid, nice tasting feed that they're receiving that is called milk during lactation, to a cold, dry, and not as good tasting feed that provides to the pigs in the weaning phase. So these highly expensive diets with all these specialty ingredients do have a huge impact on growth, and I don't think it have that much impact on the total feed cost of a pig. If we look at the lysine requirement for weaned pigs, and in this case I'm expressing it as a percent of feed, and we know that in terms of grams per day, the true requirement increases as the body weight of the pig increases, but the concentration of lysine drastically reduces. We also have that along with the lysine, all the other amino acids are also going to follow sort of the same phase, where we have a rapid increase in the requirement of those amino acids, the amounts in grams per day that those amino acids need to be consumed. But proportionally speaking, we're also going to have a good amount of reduction as a percent of the diet, or as a density of the diet, and therefore the more feeding phases we can provide to pigs, the better it's going to be. And as we'll see later on, during the weaning phase, it is recommended that we use at least 3 different feeding phases. Just like lysine, we can look at total calcium, and we can see that the concentration of calcium in the diet reduces as the body weight of the pig increases. But on a grams per day, when we talk about the requirement is increasing because these are animals on active growth. They're depositing a lot of bone. Their bones are growing, and they need calcium, as well as they'll need phosphorus and all the other minerals, and then vitamins, and most of the nutrients will follow the same pattern, where the concentration goes down with age because of the increase in feed intake, but the actual requirement, the amount of grams per day or milligrams per day or micrograms per day, it actually increases on a daily basis as body weight gain increases. Phosphorus is the same case as we saw for lysine and we saw for calcium, and again we have here that the concentration of standardized total tract digestible phosphorus decreases as the pig body weight increases. However, the requirement, the amount of phosphorus needed on a grams per day basis increases rapidly during the weaning phase. And we can see that for these three nutrients, and we can take just about all most of the other nutrients, and we'll see that the pattern will be the same. During this nursery phase, there is a very rapid increase in the amount of nutrients that the pigs needed. And we also have some nuances with their digestive system that we'll talk a little bit more in detail later on. And therefore, we need to have several feeding phases during the nursery period. We know what the nutrient requirements are for most nutrients, and we know what those values are. And for a lot of them, we even know what is the variance associated to those different nutrient requirements. Knowing the number or specific number or value of a nutrient requirement, it's definitely useful, but it's also very useful to know that a lot of nutrient requirements are expressed in a relationship to another nutrient or group of nutrients, and then we talk about ratios. And in this case, we see how the ratio of lysine to, for example, threonine, total sulfur amino acids, and tryptophan is maintained sort of constant throughout the weaning period up to 20 kilograms of body weight. We saw previously that the amount of lysine changes and the amount of these amino acids also changes, but their relationship, the ratio, it's about constant. The same cannot be said for calcium to standardized total tract digestible phosphorus, and we can see that the ratio actually follows this quadratic relationship. Also, a quadratic relationship we see between the amount of standardized ileal digestible lysine and metabolizable energy. And we can see that some nutrients, like the proportion of amino acids in the ideal protein concept, could remain fairly constant. Others change quite rapidly. Again, this is evidence for the need of having at least three feeding phases during the nursery period to make sure that we are making these adjustments in nutrient concentration and nutrient proportions to make sure that we're providing the pig what the pig needs. If we look at sodium and chloride, their concentration or the concentration needed, we can see that these two minerals follow the same quadratic shape, and we actually will tend to say that these two limes, they look very alike, and then it will be very easy to say, oh, then the ratio of these two minerals, it's about constant. But actually, when we calculate the sodium to chloride ratio in the nursery period, we see this drastic change, and we can see that this is definitely not a flat line, that there is a relationship here, there is a curvilinear relationship, and that basically indicates that the sodium and chloride ratio changes rapidly during this weaning phase of the pig. And then again, we need to have several different feeding phases in order to adjust for that. The other thing that is interesting to notice here, if we remember salt, which is the main source of sodium and chloride in the diet of pigs, sodium has a molecular weight of about 23, and chloride it's about 35.5. The ratio of sodium to chloride in regular salt, it's 0.65. And if we see in the graph on the right bottom graph, that 0.65 ratio is nowhere to be found in the relationship between sodium and chloride as needed in pigs. That basically means that we are going to need other sources of sodium or sources of sodium without chloride in order to provide a little bit more sodium than what these animals can obtain simply by adding salt to the diet. Obviously, there's a variety of different ingredients that will be used, and it will be important to make sure that we maintain that ratio. But it's always important to have a chloride-free sodium source as an ingredient. For example, sodium bicarbonate, that we can use to make sure that we're hitting the right balance between these two minerals, for example. We have talked a lot about nutrient requirements. What is a nutrient requirement? The requirement is the minimum amount of a nutrient that is needed. We saw some examples how we used a broken line analysis to titrate different amounts, and then where that line breaks is what we call the requirement. We also saw in previous talks, and we'll see it in the next slide, how when we're talking about a nutrient requirement, we're talking about a number that is an average. And as an average, it has a variance associated with. And this is what we call nutrient requirements. And let's also think about the requirement is basically that a minimum amount that we needed basically to avoid deficiencies. On the other hand, when we talk about nutrient recommendations, the recommendations are always values that are above the requirements. And these recommendations are suggested based on experience, based on observed results, based on previous experience or results or values that we have, or recommendations from experts, whether that is in our own animals at our own farm or from experiences that expert nutritionists have obtained elsewhere. These recommendations will vary widely from farm to farm, and then it's applied to both the nutrients as well as the ingredients. As some people say, hey, I have good experience using this ingredient in this way and also including these nutrients at this level above the requirements. There is a lot of knowledge here that should be provided by the expert nutritionist in charge of the nutrition of your pigs. Again, we have seen this slide, and we're going to see it again in another talk. And this is just an example of a nutrient requirement determination. In this case is lysine. And we see that we have the broken line, and that break point is what we call the requirement. But this is the requirement for a population of pigs. If we look at the next graph here on the right, we'll see this bell-shaped curve. And in this bell-shaped curve, we can see the different dots, and each one of those dots represents the lysine requirement of an individual pig. And here we have a better appreciation that the lysine requirement that we obtain, it's actually an average. And that basically means that some pigs will require more than the average, and then some pigs will require less than the average. And here is where we need to make decisions. What level are we going to use? If we formulate exactly at the requirement, then we know that we're basically meeting the lysine requirement of about 50% of the pigs. And as we increase the amount of lysine that we provide to pigs, then we'll be covering the lysine requirements of something greater than 50%, and that's what we call a recommendation. And again, those recommendations will vary greatly depending on the expert opinion and previous experiences, as well as very important to have field data and field results to see how well are we doing or what adjustments we need to make to our requirements or recommendations to make sure that we're maximizing the productivity of pigs. There's a lot of discussion about the form of feed that we should provide to nursery pigs. We can provide pigs diets that are either in meal form, that are liquid form, that they're pellet. They could be crumbled, they could even be extruded. There's a variety of different ways that we can provide, and all of them will be appropriate. Crumbled diet is something that is very uncommon in swine commercial operations. It's very common for starter broilers, but there's no need to crumble the diet because the pigs, they do have teeth, and they can use those teeth to chew pellets of different sizes, and we'll see that in more detail later on. The diameter of the pellet is something that we talk about, but again, we'll see more in detail. It's really not that big of an influence. Liquid feeding systems is something that we see in some parts of the world. They work very well, very efficiently. The main concern here is make sure that we need to have a good sanitation of all the piping and the feeders and the distribution of this liquid feed to avoid microbial fermentation as we provide the feed. The dry diets are the most common type of feed for pigs around the world. The biggest issue with the meal diets is that it can impair the flowability of the feed. In the photo that we have at the bottom, we can see what we call a bridge being formed at the bottom of a bin. That can also happen in bins, that can also happen inside the feeders, and we need to make sure that the feed is flowing properly in the feeder so the pigs can get it. In meal diets, the feeder opening needs to be adjusted properly, and we need different adjustments between meal diets and pellet diets. And also, as the pig increase in age and their feed intake increases and their ability and familiarity with the feeder increases, then we need to make proper adjustments. And it's not unheard that feeders, probably the opening of the trough, needs to be adjusted almost on a daily basis. Particle size for pigs should be somewhere between 500 and 600 microns. This is the average particle size. And we need to use a feeder that is appropriate for the nursery phase. There are feeders that we can use that can be used all the way from weaning to finisher. There are other feeders that are only for growing finishing pigs. Other that are only for nursery pigs. We need to make sure that we have the proper design of feeder for the proper age of pigs. When we talk about pelleting nursery diets, because these nursery diets, particularly the early phases, will have a lot of specialty ingredients, and a lot of those specialty ingredients are milk derived. They'll have lactose, milk, whey, and other proteins. We need to make sure that if we're going to pellet, it is recommended not to exceed 77 degrees Celsius for steam conditioning, so we don't cause heat damage of those specialty ingredients. Diets usually will contain somewhere between 3 to 4% added fat. If this is the case, then this added fat help us as a lubricant in the pellet meal. But as we increase fat in the formulation, when that fat is added at the mixer, that fat can have a little bit of a negative effect on pellet quality, and particularly on what we call the pellet durability index. We know that for pigs, if we provide pellets, but if those pellets contain more than 25% of fines, then we're basically losing all the advantage in terms of feed efficiency of feeding pellets. And at that point, we're investing a lot of time, money, and resources into making a pellet. And because that pellet it is of bad quality, having more than 20% fines, then it would be equivalent to feed a meal diet with the and the difference here is that a meal diet has a lower cost than a pellet diet. Therefore, if we're going to provide pellet diets, we need to make sure that we have good quality of pellets. As I mentioned before, pellet diameter has very little on the ability of the pig to consume pellet diets. Studies have been made throughout the years, and then the common finding of these studies is that if the pellet is of small diameter, medium diameter, or big diameter, it really doesn't make a difference in terms of the ability of nursery pig to consume diets. Furthermore, and this is the point that I want to emphasize, nursery pigs do not require pellets of a smaller diameter. And we need to take this into account because every time we change a die in a pellet mill, we're losing anywhere to around an hour worth of production time while we change one diet and swap it for another diet. If we're changing a diet simply because we're going to run diets for weaned pigs, then the scientific evidence does not support the need to change the die in a pellet mill to produce pellet of a smaller diameter. When we're talking about weaning phase, we have a huge digestive challenge, and this digestive challenge is illustrated here. These are pigs that were weaned at 4 weeks of age, and we can see the enzyme activity of both trypsin and chymotrypsin, and we can see that that enzyme activity was increasing almost in a linear fashion from birth to 4 weeks of age. Then the weaning process takes period, and we can see how both proteases, the activity of both proteases, simply plummet down for 1 week after weaning. And then 2 weeks after weaning, we can see that the levels have recovered from the lowest value post-weaning, but there are not yet, in the case of chymotrypsin, they're not yet to the level where we would have expected. So this is when what we're talking about here, that the stress of weaning has a negative consequence on the ability of pig to digest, and it's one of the reasons why we say we need to have high quality ingredients, particularly high quality protein ingredients, because we have reduced activity of enzymes and therefore we have a reduced capacity to digest those proteins. But we're not only talking about proteins. Here we see from the same group of pigs the activity of the lipase and the amylase, and lo and behold, we'll see, as with the proteases, we see a linear increase from birth to weaning. After weaning, we have a huge reduction in the activity. And in the case of the lipase, this activity has not recovered 2 weeks after weaning, and the amylase again has not recovered 2 weeks after weaning. So it's not only proteins that we need to be concerned about. We need to be concerned about fats, oils, and also starches, which basically means if we provide higher levels of fat in weaning diets, the pig doesn't have the lipase activity in order to digest and absorb those lipids. And if we don't absorb lipids along the small intestine, high concentrations of lipids are going to have an osmotic effect in the large intestine, and it's going to produce diarrhea, which could be, we could couple that to failure in protein digestion, which we're going to see a little bit more in detail in the next few slides. What we can conclude here is that weaning stress reduces the enzymatic activity of the digestive enzymes along the gastrointestinal tract of the pig, and then that those pigs, they need at least 2 weeks to recover from that stress of weaning from an digestive enzyme point of view, and it may be needed more than 2 weeks to fully recover. And again, this is another reason why we provide different feeding formulas and different feeding programs, and why we recommend or suggest to have at least 3 different feeding formulations for the nursery period. So as we talked before, this reduced capacity is for protein, starch, oils, and fat. And this capacity, it takes at least 2 weeks to recover, and more than 2 weeks for lipase. So keep in mind this, and keep in mind what's the physiology of the pig after weaning, so we make sure that we formulate diets properly, not only to provide the proper level of nutrients, but also that we're using the proper ingredients that the pig can easily digest. And let's remember, like we talked before, everything that is not digested and absorbed will be subject to fermentation in the hindgut, and not all the compounds that are fermented will produce beneficial products, as we'll see more in details in this presentation. So let's summarize some of the points that we have discussed up to this point. Why is the lysine requirement in pigs so emphasized? Why do we talk so much about lysine requirement? Well, first, lysine is the first limited amino acid for growth in pigs. Second, lysine is the basis for the ideal concept in pigs and in other species. And the third reason is that lysine is a very unique amino acid because the primary function of lysine is to be used for protein synthesis, and it really has almost no other products that are derived for lysine. So lysine is the perfect amino acid that is directly linked to the needs for protein synthesis and for protein accretion in the body of pigs and a lot of the other animals that we use in farming. What is the main digestive challenge of weaned pigs? As we saw, it is pigs, when they get weaned, they get stressed, and then the the activity of the digestive enzymes is drastically reduced, and therefore drastically reduce their ability to digest the components and the nutrients that we provide in the diets. Because weaning diets are so expensive, then this is the ideal target to reduce feed cost and to try to cut corners and to try to use cheaper ingredients. Yes or no? No. Why not? Because the animal, the pig, is under a lot of stress. It has reduced digestive enzyme capacity, and at the end, the amount of feed that is consumed during this weaning phase is relatively small compared to the total amount of feed that the pigs will consume. And then if we want to reduce feeding costs, the nursery period definitely is not the place to look for ways to reduce cost. If we want to reduce cost and have an impact, we definitely need to look at the diets for growth finishing pigs, but not the nursery diets, and for certain not the first 1 or 2 phases of feed that we provide to weaned pigs.